Buenas tardes, soy Miguel Urbán, eurodiputado del Grupo de la Izquierda en el Parlamento Europeo y miembro de Anticapitalistas. Como sabemos, el derecho a la protesta pacífica está reconocido por todas las constituciones nacionales de los Estados europeos, así como en marcos normativos comunitarios como el Convenio Europeo de Derechos Humanos. Pero cualquier análisis crítico del liberalismo político nos invita a concebir las leyes como la traducción normativa de la correlación de fuerzas dada en cada momento histórico. Y hoy, esa correlación de fuerzas dibuja, por un lado, a sectores populares cada vez más golpeados por las múltiples crisis que azotan a las mayorías sociales, y por otro lado, a gobiernos temerosos de ese malestar que por activa o por pasiva se suben a la ola reaccionaria mundial que estamos viviendo. Evidentemente no es nuevo que la acción popular sea considerada como un enemigo del orden público, ni tampoco que los derechos y libertades fundamentales se hayan convertido en mera retórica en ausencia de voluntad política para hacerlos efectivos. Pero sí es novedoso el actual giro autoritario que vive Europa, donde incluso los discursos y leyes empiezan a quitarse la máscara y a plantear abiertamente marcos normativos represivos que ponen en la diana a un derecho tan básico como el derecho a la protesta. De esta forma vemos brotar legislaciones que criminalizan la protesta, mientras aumenta la represión violenta contra las manifestaciones. Y todo ello ante una Unión Europea que carece de herramientas y sobre todo de voluntad política para emprender procedimientos judiciales ante la vulneración de derechos básicos. Porque no nos perdamos en trampas formales. Cuando Europa quiere aplicar una norma, aparece de la nada los recursos, los tiempos y los procedimientos necesarios para hacerlo. Es un problema de voluntad política que no se haga ahora. ¿Por qué? Porque el poder establecido le cuesta cada vez más legitimar su existencia a través de mecanismos de seducción, de convencer a la gente en definitiva. Y frente al malestar social de la gestión de una crisis permanente en la que vivimos y de las protestas que se deriven de la misma, se recurre cada vez más al palo y cada vez menos a la zanahoria. Hoy, el neoliberalismo realmente existente es un neoliberalismo de tintes autoritarios. Si ya era falaz la supuesta referencia al liberalismo económico clásico, el actual neoliberalismo cada vez tiene menos también de aquel teórico liberalismo político de las libertades y de los derechos civiles. De hecho, estamos viendo el resurgimiento de un poderoso movimiento iliberal que cuestiona los principios básicos de las libertades civiles. Aquí, en el Parlamento Europeo, se suele destacar los casos de Polonia y Hungría como ejemplos de democracias iliberales. Y es cierto que la persecución al movimiento feminista, al movimiento LGTBI en Polonia o a las ONGs críticas en Hungría son ejemplos sangrantes de esta deriva autoritaria. Pero es igual de cierto que a otros muchos países europeos les interesa agitar el espantapájaros de Visegrado para que no miramos lo que está pasando en su propia casa. Estamos ante un problema más amplio de lo que engloba a los llamados países del eje de Visegrado. Por ejemplo, en Grecia se aprobó hace apenas un mes una ley de seguridad ciudadana que restringe sustancialmente el derecho a manifestarse. En Bulgaria, quien se manifiesta en estas semanas contra la corrupción de la clase política, sufre una represión policial que está amparada por una impunidad terrible. En Francia hemos visto estos días las multitudinarias protestas contra el proyecto de ley de seguridad ciudadana que ha obligado al gobierno de Macron a recular momentáneamente. Por cierto, Macron, aquel príncipe republicano el que venía a renovar y a recuperar las libertades europeas y ya ha terminado comprando la agenda reaccionaria de Marine Le Pen. ¿Y qué decir de la ley Mordaza española, que cumple ahora 5 años, a pesar de todas las críticas recibidas, de los recursos de inconstitucionalidad presentados y de las promesas electorales de modificación legislativa? Ahí sigue, vigente, en total funcionamiento y ya, como decíamos antes, son 5 años. En todos estos casos nos encontramos con marcos jurídicos caracterizados cada vez más por definiciones intencionadamente vagas sobre el derecho a la reunión, a la manifestación o a la protesta y su eventual represión. Esto permite, por un lado, una interpretación arbitraria, discrecional y desproporcionada por parte de los Estados de estos derechos fundamentales o incluso también de su criminalización. Y por otro, asegura además un marco normativo de impunidad en el ejercicio de la represión y del control por parte de las fuerzas de seguridad del Estado. Pero además, con la pandemia y su gestión, este giro represivo que estábamos conociendo se está viendo ahora como una nueva vuelta de tuerca. En nombre de la salud pública se avanza sin justificación alguna en una agenda reaccionaria de recortes de derechos y libertades, de refuerzo del control social y de la criminalización del pensamiento crítico. Por todo ello, actos como este hoy son extremadamente necesarios. Así que sin más, quiero daros las gracias a quienes, en su mayoría, con un trabajo invisible, hacéis posible estas jornadas y a las organizaciones de toda Europa que participan en esta actividad. Desde aquí, desde el Parlamento Europeo de Bruselas, un fuerte abrazo y ánimo con las jornadas.
Dear members of the European Parliament, Freund and Donat, dear representative of the European Commission, dear colleagues and friends, it is an honor to be with you today, albeit virtually, to discuss the need to protect the right to peaceful assembly. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and also member of the European Parliament. Unfortunately, we couldn't see him, Miguel Urban, for hosting this meeting. Coincidentally, today, 3 December, also marks the official end of the Cold War at the Malta Summit 31 years ago. But in reality, the Cold War was ended by the people who brought down the Berlin Wall on 9 November 1989. And for me, it's one of my strongest political memories. I remember it as if it happened yesterday. Crowds of people gathering by the wall from both sides, a wall that had divided them and the world, physically and ideologically, for decades. Here were individuals coming together to express themselves collectively, to demand the right to shape their future society. And this, dear participants, is the very essence of freedom of peaceful assembly. Most, if not all of you, have your roots in civil society. I therefore do not need to convince you that protests, when peaceful, are a healthy expression of democratic values and a powerful instrument of societal change. This is even more so when participatory mechanisms are deficient or, as in some countries in the world still today, absent. Freedom of peaceful assembly is a human right. It is also an expression of the right to participate in public affairs. Moreover, freedom of peaceful assembly is what we call an enabling right, meaning it opens the door to claim other human rights like economic, social, or cultural rights. And this is particularly important for marginalized groups who may not have access to traditional platforms to express their demands. Today, and this started before COVID-19, we are witnessing a trend of shrinking civic space globally as well as in Europe. Shrinking civic space is often a marker for a general deterioration of human rights in a country. Our UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, in his call to action for human rights, has therefore called on all actors to step up efforts to support and protect civil society. As he said, and I quote, "Society is stronger and more resilient when people can play a meaningful role in political, economic, and social life, including by expressing dissent and joining together to express their views." As the year 2020 is drawing to a close, it is clear that the COVID-19 crisis has posed unprecedented challenges to human rights, the rule of law, and democracy, further accelerating an already worrying trend. Basic tenets like the independence of the judiciary, transparent and accountable governance, media freedom, and the separation of powers have come under threat. In September this year, the European Commission issued its much anticipated first assessment of the rule of law in the European Union. It is a welcome exercise of introspection, and our office has followed the process closely, and you may be interested in our publication, which is called The Case for a Human Rights Approach to the Rule of Law, and which you can find on our website, UN Human Rights Europe. We think it is very positive that the European Commission has not interpreted the rule of law in a narrow sense in its first report, and that it has covered aspects like media pluralism and institutional checks and balances. For the next rule of law report, we would encourage the Commission to broaden the scope further and to also assess the right to participate in public affairs, for the simple reason that participation, be it in the form of information sharing, consultation, or co-decision making, has a significant impact on the quality of laws and policies that are eventually adopted. We also encourage the Commission in its next report and the Council of the EU, which has started a peer review process, to assess freedom of association and peaceful assembly in EU member states. From an international human rights perspective, it would be difficult to exclude freedom of association and freedom of peaceful assembly from an assessment of the rule of law, because these rights are critical for holding the state to account and an essential feature of a healthy democracy. The UN Human Rights Committee, which monitors the implementation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and issues legally binding recommendations to states, has explicitly linked freedom of assembly to the rule of law. In its General Comment 37, which it adopted earlier this year, the committee says, and I quote, that freedom of assembly, together with other related rights, constitutes the very foundation of a system of participatory governance based on democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and pluralism. The right of peaceful assembly has come under a lot of pressure in recent times. And so the question you asked me, Alexandrina, is, can freedom of peaceful assembly be restricted under international law? The answer is yes, but only under strict conditions. Restrictive measures must have a basis in law, be absolutely necessary, and time-bound. They must be proportionate to the objective pursued, and they may not discriminate. The burden lies with states to show that these conditions are met. Restrictions must also be kept under constant review, and they must be lifted when no longer essential. That means that even in times of a health pandemic, states must facilitate peaceful assemblies. They can do so by providing guidance on how to organize assemblies in a manner that is compatible with public health needs, like, for example, mandating physical distancing measures. There are some good practices in Europe which show that public health and the right of individuals to assemble can be reconciled and are not mutually exclusive. As we end the year 2020, we've seen global demonstrations erupting in support of the Black Lives Matter movement, pro-democracy protests in the wake of the Belarusian presidential elections, mass demonstrations by women in Poland, and protests against police violence in France, and all of this during a global pandemic. As you mentioned, COVID-19 has put states under tremendous pressure to curb the spread of the virus and to do so rapidly. And many countries have passed laws to limit freedom of movement and freedom of assembly, sometimes restricting rights in a disproportionate manner, and sometimes taking political advantage of the situation. Our UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, and UN human rights experts have expressed concern about states using the health crisis to pass sweeping emergency laws, to rule by decree, to place restrictions on civil society organizations, or to limit access to information. And they have urged states to put human rights at the center of the COVID-19 response. The UN Special Rapporteur on the right to peaceful assembly and association has developed a useful set of principles to guide states' response to the health crisis. And to cite just a few of these principles, he emphasizes that legal measures must, of course, respect human rights, that the pandemic must not be used as a pretext for rights infringements, and that consultations with civil society should take place before new measures are adopted. In fact, civil society should be seen as a strategic partner in the fight against the pandemic. The crisis must also not be used to prevent civil society organizations, defense lawyers, and journalists from undertaking vital work monitoring the police, prisons, or migrant detention centers. In these times of uncertainty, it is important that judicial and parliamentary checks and balances are strengthened. It is equally important that democratic oversight mechanisms, national human rights institutions, civil society, and the international community keep a watchful eye on measures that restrict rights in the name of crisis prevention and containment of the spread of the virus. The crisis is no justification for excessive force to be used when dispersing assemblies, nor for disproportionate penalties to be imposed. Governments must remember, and must sometimes be reminded, that these measures are there to protect people's health and safety, and not to shield the government from criticism. We count on you, dear colleagues, to help us in this endeavor and to keep up your tireless efforts for our human rights and freedoms. Each one of us makes a difference, and together we make a change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Birgit, for this very inspiring invitation. Thank you also for reminding what are the international standards for the protection of the right to assembly. Let's go now to the next part of our discussion, where we have invited, as I said, 3 prominent activists that are all carrying behind huge struggles in their countries. For rights, for democracy. Some of these struggles are really long-standing. I will first introduce Aria Halimi, and I will maybe switch also to French to take the opportunity of the multilingualism. Aria Halimi, il est membre du bureau central de la Ligue des droits de l'homme en France. Il est aussi avocat, spécialiste en droit pénal et violences policières.
He's a member of the Ligue des droits de l'homme in France, specialist in law, and he will give us some arguments to explain the shift that we have noticed in France since the terrorist attack, a shift from a state of law to a state of police, with which culminated on the draft legislation that was submitted a few days ago, and which led to a huge mobilization by the population. So I give you the floor for 7 minutes.
I will speak first about the right to protest and the freedom to peaceful assembly in France.
Je parlerai d'abord du droit de défense de la des manifestations pacifiques en France.
Which can be divided into legal, administrative, judicial, and practical obstacles to the enjoyment of those rights and freedoms. First of all, we have the legal obstacles. We had during the Yellow Vest movement a new law in the April 10th of 2019. It was a law named Loi Anti-Casseurs. One provision of this law was censored by the Conseil Constitutionnel, the Supreme Court, namely the provision granting prefects the power to decide a prohibition on protesting on a national territory for a duration of 1 month. Measure applied to individuals considered as particularly severe threat to public order. During a protest demonstration 2 weeks ago, demonstration we organized against a new law. This new law is named Loi Sécurité Globale, and this new law is about to prevent journalists and people to film and to make movies about cops during violence. Lastly, Article 6 of the Loi Anti-Casseurs punishes with 1 year of imprisonment and a fine of 15,000 euros the fact of hiding, even partially, the face during a demonstration. Right now, it's you can be fined just because you have you hide your face, or because you don't hide your face because you don't have a mask. So it's completely crazy right now. Second, the administrative obstacles about demonstration. There is a trend of successive prohibition of demonstrations without possibility of administrative appeal, which prevents protesters from exercising their right to peaceful assembly. Such prohibitions appear contradictory to the French legislation on protest, as those need only to be declared but not authorized. Third, the judicial obstacles. Preventive interpellation, for example, of the Yellow Vest before protests. During the Yellow Vest movement, several main representatives of this movement were subject to a preventive interpellation and were therefore unable to take part in the protest. Of course, a preventive interpellation cannot be considered as a necessary and proportionate answer, as it takes place before any form of trouble to public order. The close link between the prefects and the prosecutor's office is also an obstacle. Both offices work closely together to contain and repress protests. The prosecutor of the Republic of Paris, for instance, required all police custodies to be carried out for the maximum amount of time possible, which is 48 hours, without any particular reason, to prevent Yellow Vests from returning to the seat of the protests. A specific offense was set out to repress protesters, which is the offense of regrouping for the purposes of committing offenses. This offense can be easily used against protesters, as it is easily considered that all protesters taking part in a partially violent protesters are responsible for the violence and intended it. There is a broad use of the public order notion, which is used to limit the right to peaceful assembly and protesting. And we have also, and for practical obstacles, to finish before telling a few words about the pandemic crisis. So practical obstacles for demonstration. Police brutality is used as a tool to create a chilling effect on protesters, as it is increasingly dangerous to take part to a protest. Amongst other chilling techniques, there is the extensive use of intermediary weapons, such as LBD and ribbon bullets and grenades, which inflict severe permanent damage. Law enforcement technique, which consists in surrounding and trapping protesters, forcing them to remain in the same spot for hours. This technique can be considered as a deprivation of liberty, since protesters are not able to leave the perimeter, even to leave the protest. The massive use of drones as a surveillance means, even though the use of drones is not regulated by legal provision. Now we have the new law, global security, which aims to legalize a drone. Coupled with facial recognition technology and the prohibition to cover one's face during a protest, any protesters can be immediately identified by law enforcement agents. General strategy of illegalism. The law enforcement use techniques which are not per se illegal, but which drastically limit the right to peaceful assembly and the right to protest. Very often, those techniques are not regulated by any form of legal provision. To finish, what happened during the pandemic, since the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, the right to protest has been considerably reduced. The right to protest as such is one of the exceptions to the second national confinement. Therefore, individuals are allowed to gather during protests. However, this derogation was not applicable during the first confinement, which led to massive protesting amongst the population, as this happened right during the wave of protests linked to the pension system reform. On the 13th June 2020, the Conseil d'État, Supreme Court, Administrative Supreme Court, struck this decision, considering that the right to protest could not be annihilated during and after the confinement, which ended on 11 May 2020. However, at the local level, prefects could limit the right to protest for moving protests, allowing only static gatherings.
Okay, thank you. Maybe you were concerned about the time, but I would like to complete also the picture by the fact, let's not shy away to cry victory when we have it. I would really like to stress that due to enormous mobilization in France, triggered by your organization, League of Human Rights, and also a lot of organization, also of journalists and trade unions that joined forces, and hundreds of thousands of people took up to the streets in 70 cities across France last weekend, for example. And due to this enormous mobilization, the government seems to step back, at least on Article 24, that poses serious concerns regarding this interdiction to disseminate images of policemen during demonstrations. So
exactly, indeed, we had a very huge demonstration on Saturday. Maybe 500,000 people all over France in 110 cities. In Paris, we were 150,000, and exactly the government now is obliged to say that he has to suppress or to rewrite the 24th article. This article is the article to prohibit to film and publish the cops' images with the intent of doing bad things on cops. So, but right now the 24th article is in a bad. Good. We have now. We have to fight and against the article which wants to organize and to legalize drone and massive surveillance with drone. We are in a struggle, a huge struggle with journalists, with citizens, and with all humanitarian associations now.
Thank you. Now I'm a little bit concerned with the time, so I will skip my bridges building sentences. I will go directly to Marta Lempart, and I think she does not need an introduction, but still she's one of the prominent faces of Polish women's strike, if not the most prominent, but I know she's modest. The Polish women's strike recently turned into a sort of war against the attempts in 2016 to pass in Poland a near ban on abortion. And this is not only a huge mobilization on issues of restriction of reproductive rights, but also the women strikers mobilized hugely communities beyond this issue in defense of democracy and against deterioration of rule of law. So Marta will share with us the current struggles that citizens face in the streets of Poland, including the struggle against this near total ban on abortion, but also on public demonstrations, violent counter-demonstrations by the far right, police violence, and arrests of many peaceful protesters. Marta, the floor is yours. Unmute yourself, please. Mike.
Okay, thank you for the invitation, and we couldn't be more on time with what's happening, because as you said, we've been having protests that started with the so-called Constitutional Court announcement of the ban on abortion. It's not a legal ruling, but still it appeared. And we've been having protests for today is the 43rd day of protests. And we're talking almost 600 cities, of course not protesting every day, but still 600 cities, almost 1 million people, and 70% of people in Poland actually supporting the protests. And also young people, among young people, 29% of young people took part and attends the protests. So what started with the attempt to ban abortion, this time not with the parliament, but via the so-called Constitutional Court, which is not operating legally after it was hijacked in 2015. Then went to many other spheres, the huge anti-government protests and the basic call for the government to step down. But now we have another angle, and it has just started for a week, I think. Now the major struggle is the freedom of assembly, because the tactics and basically the orders that the police was given have changed, and the violence appeared, and the change was really significant in what we can see. But let me say something first about the legal situation. We have the pandemic, but our government decided not to recognize it in any way with any state of emergency, and basically we don't have laws that would comply with our constitution limiting freedom to assembly, because to put these bills, to impose these bills limiting freedom of assembly, we would need a state of emergency, which was not declared in Poland because the government decided to basically skip that, not to do that, because of the compensations that they would have to pay to businesses. Now they don't. And also we would need a parliamentary bill to limit freedom of assembly, and they didn't do that. It's just a ministry's announcement. So so from the legal point of view, we don't have legally any restrictions that would be imposed, at least legally. Of course, the fiction, this illegal fiction of the ban on of public gatherings is there, and it's holding very strong, because against us there's the police and there's the whole uniformed forces and ununiformed forces. And what was happening and what started happening 2 weeks ago, but especially last week in Poland, is imposing this illegal ban on legal assembly towards the protesters. And my angle on that is that the police violence that we've seen, things that were happening, gassing, the gas being used against the peaceful protesters, and the beatings, and the police, ununiformed police, anti-terrorist brigades being used to provoke the crowd, to beat people up, to use the gas, detention of at least one journalist, using gas against journalists, like the targeted attacks on journalists, targeted attacks on people running away, also being chased by the police, people being kettled, closed in certain spaces, not being able to go, so being basically illegally detained, and not being able to move, to go home, and so on. But it starts with the orders, and it starts with the basic lie and breaking the law on this very symbolic level, which means that the police in Poland was given orders to lie that these assemblies are not legal, that we don't have the right to protest because of some bill that was imposed, which we know it wasn't, at least not legally. The police was ordered and to lie that they have the basis to take people's documents, to take people's data, so to harass people, to intimidate them like that. It's not legal in Poland for the police to just ask people for their documents and to take down their data because they are just somewhere in the street. It's not legal. But the police lies, it is. And it always goes along with a blackmail. If you don't give your data, if you don't show your documents, you'll be taken down to the police station. And some people actually deny giving their documents, giving their data, and they are being taken to the police stations, and they are being detained. And it's more and more, and it's growing. The number of people who actually do that is growing. And the next situations, we have the whole system that should prevent the police from using measures like gas or batons or hitting people, especially the police that is not in uniforms. But we're talking about the total illegal actions now. And the violence is just a result of that. The violence is the result of this order that says you can do anything and pretend that it's legal. You can break all the laws that we have on how the police should work and how the public assemblies are regulated, because Jarosław Kaczyński decided to do that. And it's very hard for everyone to go along with, and it's very hard to accept that. And that's basically the first step of the protests in Poland. First, we were protesting for against the attempt to ban abortion. Then we still are protesting for the government to step down. But this third part now is the protest against the police violence, is the protest for the freedom of assembly. It's the solidarity protest with people who were actually detained and beaten up and have suffered from police violence. So this is the major battlefield now, the freedom of assembly. And against us is the state that lies on human rights, lies on civic rights, and lies about how we are not allowed to gather and express ourselves publicly. So this is the major struggle, and we now have answer to that, because it became, of course, we're looking for the Polish point of view, and we still don't have these horrible situations that sometimes happen in the Western Europe also, or in Eastern Europe. But we're talking about the whole collapse of the system that does not even pretend to obey any laws. I am the example also, because I'm one of the persons who is openly declaring that I'm these protests organizer, and I am the person who also denies and also doesn't give the data or the documents to the police. And there are never consequences of that. Instead of that, people who are 14 or 17 or protests in smaller cities are being detained, are being harassed, are being visited at their homes, are being charged. So what we also see, that they use these illegal laws and some parts of the penal code that doesn't apply to the situation against the people who attend the protests, or people who organize the protests, but in smaller and middle-sized cities. And they never come to us, and they don't come to arrest me. They don't, although they write the letters that every organizer can be put in jail for 8 years. So this is also this part when the state doesn't even pretend to work along any rules, any laws. They just pick the persons who they try to use some laws against, and some they don't come for me. I have from these protests for the last 4 weeks, I have one charge because about swearing in public, although I organized and coordinated most of the protests, so I should face up to 8 years in jail, and at least that's what they say. And they don't do that. So we're talking about the total collapse of this part of the legal system and of the laws that are being used against the protesters and are being used to harass people, to scare them, because we see the effects already. People know that if they come to Warsaw or they come to Katowice or some other places where the police became violent, it means the beatings, it means being kettled, it means being not able to go, it means being scared. And we never had that. We had it more or less normally for many, many years. So yeah, today we're talking about the major struggle that is on Polish streets now. So the time couldn't be better. That's the struggle now. Yeah.
Thank you, Marta, for these very touchy testimonies, and I think that the Polish case is quite well advertised, so to say, in the media.
I have to add something. Sorry. I had to judicial independence. Again, we're talking about the rule of law. They lose every case. The police lose every case against the protesters, against the organizers. They have to pay compensations for illegal detentions. They lose all the cases where people complain about police actions, basically, in the courts. So we're back to the square one, to the judicial independence, to the rule of law. That's how, this is also the example of that.
Thank you. In any case, so far, Polish people are not giving up, and we saw the contrary. This maybe had also some galvanizing effect, because the recent protests that we saw were also quite unprecedented since the fall of communism in Poland. So I think they are also the defenders. So to say, Polish people also became today, going out to the streets, they become the defenders of European values and of Europe as such, also in the context of the veto that threatens the Polish government to impose to the European budget. Let's go to the next and the last speaker from the side of civil society, of civic activists. I will now introduce Anaís Franquesa from Defender a quien defiende. She's a Spanish criminal lawyer specialist in human rights, social movements, and international humanitarian law. And she will talk about the gag law in Spain that provides quite a background to restrict the right to protest and dissent in general, and this since 2015, since its adoption in the context of the post-Spanish Indignados movement. So, Anaís, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the inspiring and interesting interventions of our panelists today, and thank you, Alexandrina, for the presentation. Yes, I'm going to talk about gag law, but above all in context of the COVID pandemic and how is the situation in Spain since the declaration of the state of alarm, the 14th of March. Spain declared the state of alarm. That is one of the three exceptional measures that can be applied. No? There is the state of alarm, state of emergency, and also in cases of war, there is a third one. No? The state of alarm was declared on the 14th of March. It was the second time and that it's been declared since the establishment of the democracy. It imposed a strict lockdown, like in other places of Europe, where population was obligated to remain at home, only allowing to go outside for predetermined reasons, like jobs of special need, or getting supplies, or going to the pharmacy, or taking care of vulnerable people, and things like that. But in this executive order was not established the system of violations and penalties in case of unjustified displacement. Thus, there was a confused legislation about the consequences of lockdown infringement, with an extraordinary scope for interpretation by law enforcement agencies. Therefore, the legislation most used was this gag law that was approved in 2015 and was very criticized by human rights organizations and also UN reporters because of the threats against the freedom of assembly and freedom of expression, for example. Actually, one of the articles of the gag law prohibits or banned the use of images, photos and videos from the police, and justifying it that in cases that this use of photos can be a threat of their intimacy, and then I think it could be very similar to this article in the French bill that now they are going to change apparently. No? Anyway, from the 14th of March to the 21st of June, more than 1.1 million of proposed sanctions were initiated based on this gag law, and more than 9,000 people were detained in relation of the lockdown measures. The majority of the fines were based in the article that prohibits disobedience against authorities or law enforcement agents. However, there was the criteria for applying the legal precept of disobedience was not clear, provoking an open discussion between the state attorney and the Ministry of Interior. No? This is really strange because there is of course there is a jurisprudence and judicial statements of how this criminal offense based on disobedience have to be applied, and they change it radically during the COVID pandemic. And it's because of this that actually currently hundreds of these proposed sanctions are being considered not valid by the courts, like in Poland. From the beginning, and because of the increasing number of human rights violations that we were facing, the organizations from DQD, Defender a quien defiende, we started to monitor the law enforcement agencies registering and denouncing cases of disproportionate use of force, torture, ill-treatment, or abusive acts from police officers. And in less than 3 months, we registered 330 incidents, 70 of them cases of disproportionate use of force. It has to be taken into account that during this time, demonstrations were limited. Afterwards, I will explain about legal terms, but the most part of people remain at home and they were like respecting these lockdown measures. But of course, there was people that was not able to respect that. For example, migrant people without their administrative situation legally, that they went to work and they were stopped, and because of they cannot justify this journey or this travel, they were fined, Or also other people like homeless that of course they were not able to accomplish the lockdown because they don't have houses to be. They were also fined. Anyway, I was saying that because we had these 330 incidents, but in a context of general accomplishment of the lockdown, then there are several cases. We detect also an increase of identifications by ethnic profile and other police abuse against vulnerable people. Because of that, we sent 2 communications to the Spanish Ombudsman and also 2 communications to the Ministry of Interior stating these situations and asking for the adoption of preventive measures, investigating. We ask also for investigation in cases of alleged crimes and concrete guidelines to apply the state of alarm and also the system of violations and sanctions. And we were asking for these guidelines to be respectful with human rights standards. Finally, we published a human rights guide in COVID context, and we made several interventions in mass media denouncing the situation. In terms of the right of peaceful assembly, we have different situations. There were contradictory resolutions from the national courts. The first day that it was stated was when the trade unions wanted to call for the demonstrations of the 1st of May, that every year, of course, it happens, And in that context, in some places, the public authorities ban these demonstrations. even in the cases where the organizing entities were guaranteeing or trying to ensure that sanitary measures would take place, like using masks or personal distance, and in some cases even using the cars, and then no contact at all between the demonstrators. And even in these cases, in some cities, the demonstrations were banned, and in other places were not. And in some places were banned, and the demonstrators went to the court to trying to be allowed to demonstrate. And then these different cases also result in different resolutions. Some of the national courts say that the state of alarm don't foresees formal suspension of rights. It is not foreseen that the state of alarm can allow the suspension of the right of freedom of assembly. And then in this course decide that the demonstration, if the sanitary measures took place, they had to be allowed to celebrate. But in other places, the national courts decide that even the state of alarm doesn't allow general suspension of the freedom of peaceful assembly. In this case of COVID pandemic, the concrete banning or the concrete prohibition of the demonstration was reasonable and justified. In that cases, in some of the cases, finally it arrived the case to the Constitutional Court, and the Spanish Constitutional Court states that the prohibition of the demonstration by the authorities was not a direct consequence of the state of alarm declaration, but a consequence of the scope of interpretation by the authorities. This is good. It means that the state of alarm doesn't allow directly this suspension or prohibition, but what the Constitutional Court considered was that in that particular case, the limitation was reasonable and justified, not taking into account the sanitary measures proposed by the organizing entities. On the 25th of October, the state of alarm, the first state of alarm, was approved from the 14th of March to the 21st of June, but each 15 days it had to have a new approval by the parliament, the Spanish parliament, and then each 15 days there was a discussion in parliamentary, in the parliament about that, about the reasonability or not to continue the state of alarm. But on the 25th of October, the Spanish government declared again the state of alarm, but this time it states that the state of alarm will be binding for 6 months. Because it's compulsory, after 15 days, they had to go to the parliament, but in the Spanish parliament approved this state of alarm for 6 months, and it's a exceptional measure that with a long time to be applied. In this state of alarm, it doesn't establish a general lockdown, but establish a curfew during the night. In the executive order, again, it's not established a particular system of violations and penalties, but this legislative gap has been filled by the governments of the autonomous regions in some cases. And in relation with the right of peaceful assembly, this time it has a direct reference and says that the executive order foresees that the gathering in public places and demonstrations, exercising the right of peaceful assembly could be limited, constrained, or banned if the personal distance it is not ensured in the notification presented by the organizers. Then in that time, there is a special article referred to the freedom of peaceful assembly. And finally, each week,
if you can get closer.
30 seconds.
So the end.
Finally, each week we receive denuncias of disproportionate use of force by police, above all occurred during the curfew, and we consider that these denuncias are increasing. It is for us a matter of concern that these situations could increase even more when the economic and social effects of the pandemic shall be even more tangible than now. And then it is reasonable to think that in context of economic and social crisis, the number of demonstrations and protests shall increase, and with them the number of human rights violations. Thank you.
Thank you, Anaïs. Thank you to you all for this quite gloomy picture, and it's a hard task now for the next speakers that we invited today to react and to tell us about the perspectives that we have to use EU law and mechanisms to safeguard democracy, to safeguard our checks and balances, and to safeguard the right to protest and to express dissent. I will have to change a little bit the order of their intervention to allow Daniel Freund to go take care of his small kids. Also, we took a lot of delay with so we didn't respected the time. So I will immediately give the floor to Daniel Freund. He's a member of the European Parliament from the Greens group, and yeah, please share with us first reactions maybe regarding what you heard. Also, what is the work of the European Parliament regarding all these issues, and what avenues you see in European frameworks that we can use to protect the right to protest.
I come from civil society, from Transparency International as well. So I obviously follow very closely questions around transparency, democracy issues, but also the fight against corruption. And I think, I mean, these stories that we just heard on this call are in a way, you know, the last installment of something that is a broad development in many EU member states, unfortunately. And it was mentioned in the first intervention already that the Commission did this general assessment of the rule of law, that we do have what I would classify as a rule of law crisis in the European Union. And definitely the corona pandemic has not made this any easier, and particularly in those countries where we had some issues before, the situation has actually gotten worse with the pandemic. So I was one of the Parliament negotiators on this rule of law conditionality, that bit that is now posing issues with the governments of Poland and Hungary. That's why they're blocking the budget and the corona recovery. But I think this is really a decisive time in European Union history if we manage to win that battle, to hopefully defend the rule of law better in the future. I also hope that, given that we now have a broader debate about this, that I think, given this struggle, you know, citizens all across the Union have learned in much more detail what the situation in Hungary and Poland is like, and I really hope that gets things moving, because we also know that yes, it's great to have this new tool if it eventually comes online, but we also know that the Commission these last few years, and it definitely hasn't gotten any better with the von der Leyen Commission, is not really making use of the tools that they already have at their disposal, right? That we now have several EU member states outright ignoring rulings of the European Court of Justice, that the Commission hasn't even triggered financial sanctions on that yet, that they are not using the full potential of, well, what's called in technical terms the Common Provisions Regulation, right? Where they already have the possibility to cut funding to member states on structural funds, for example, that they are not, you know, launching infringement procedures wherever they can. Those are worrying signs, and I hope that the current struggle over the budget and the rule of law conditionality also gets things moving on, in general, the openness of the Commission to use the tools that it has to protect our fundamental rights, to protect the values that are at the basis of the union. Because if we don't do that, then I really fear for the European Union. One point I wanted to make before I close, because I mean I fully agree with the assessment of the speakers before me and the horrible situation we see in some of the member states. But of course, when it comes to the right of assembly in particular, well, or all fundamental rights really, there always is a balancing act, right? There is multiple fundamental rights, and none of these rights by itself supersedes everything, but it's a balancing act between the different fundamental rights that we all have. And one thing I see in my own member state, in Germany, regarding the right to assembly, particularly now under these corona conditions, we have these giant demonstrations by people that think corona is a hoax, that there's some sort of Nazi takeover in Germany, and that want to protest ignoring all social distancing, mask wearing rules and whatnot. And that's obviously an issue, right? How to balance the freedom of speech, the right to assembly, with the physical integrity of all of us, and the necessity to altogether fight this pandemic, right? And I think one of the difficulties, certainly, that we see at the level of the European Union to crack down on those that really abuse the current situation for their own political gain, or to crack down on opposition or protesters, is that when they can point to other member states that maybe have issues that at first sight might seem different, but that are completely different. And I think, Anna can speak to that in more detail, but Hungary and the Hungarian government has been an expert player in, for each little measure that they're taking, they find another member state that has this, but obviously no other country has assembled quite the toxic mix of measures that Hungary has, and that is obviously an issue. Maybe so far for me, and I'm very sorry that I have to run and can't answer any of your questions, because under these corona conditions and with a newborn at home, it's just a bit difficult to manage the evenings. But if any of you have any specific questions to me, do feel free to send me an email or contact me on social media, and I'll get back to you on any questions you might have. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much for being with us despite all these difficulties. We know how hard it is, and you saw also how frustrating it is for kids to see their parents at home and not having access to them. Yes, I will now give the floor to our next speaker. Nyovi Ringu, she is head of Justice Policy and Rule of Law Unit in DG Justice, and she has been, so to say, the architect, the main architect of the European Commission first Rule of Law report that we saw in the beginning of the fall. The Rule of Law report was very much expected. Very high expectations have been raised by this. It's a first attempt to have a country-by-country assessment of the rule of law, and to get out of this dialectics, liberals against the illiberals, and authoritarians against Western democratics. We as civil society, we contributed also to the report, and we appreciate that there have been steps to recognize better the role of civil society and the role of civic actors and human rights defenders in safeguarding our democracy. So we have been recognized as important checks and balances. Nevertheless, we were quite critical about the country reports, so to say. because our contacts on the ground provided us with very complex information that unfortunately we couldn't see in the country reports. But I will give you the floor to explain maybe also the complexity of this first exercise, and to tell us what are the next steps. How can we now use the report and the findings of the report to drive some positive action to better to reinforce the democratic checks and balances, including the right to freedom of assembly, the freedom of assembly, which unfortunately was not included in the first report, but maybe there's scope to enlarge for next time. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much for not wasting time. Maybe you can only hear me. Many thanks for inviting us today and give us the opportunity to take part in this roundtable on the right to peaceful assembly, and the opportunity to present very briefly the first rule of law annual report that was adopted by the Commission the 30th of September. Just to stress, and you are all maybe aware, that the right to freedom of peaceful assembly is enshrined in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. It is the Article 12, which says that everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and to freedom of association at all levels, in particular in political, trade unions, and civic matters. And also talks about the joint trade unions. So according to this article, the Commission expects that member states would act in full respect of the fundamental rights and the democratic freedoms upon which the Union is built. Of course, the safeguarding of the right to peaceful protest and the application of rules in respect of demonstrations are a national responsibility. In such cases, it is for the member states themselves, including also the judiciary authorities, the courts, to ensure that the fundamental rights are effectively respected and protected in accordance with the national legislation and the international human rights obligations. And civil society has a crucial role, a key role to play for upholding the common values on which the EU is funded. I don't need to repeat in that audience what is these common values. It's the rule of law, the fundamental rights, and democracy. So a strong, independent civil society is much needed to foster an open and pluralist space for debate, and very importantly, the citizens' participation to the democratic life of the EU. And civil society organizations play a crucial role also in helping the victims of the violations of their fundamental rights, and in particular, the ones that they are the more vulnerable. As you rightly pointed out, the civil society organizations have continuously provided us with invaluable set of information on what is happening on the ground. This is what we are trying to do also with the first rule of law report and its country chapters. Of course, we are aware that in some member states, there is a sort of a progressive erosion of this civic space, in particular as regards civil society organizations engaged in the promotion of fundamental rights and the rule of law. And supporting these organizations, it is, of course, a shared responsibility of the EU, but also from the member states, and remains among the priorities also of the Commission. And for these reasons, we are particularly pleased of the proposal made by the European Parliament to increase the funding to civil society organizations. And following the agreement reached on 10 November, the Citizens' Equality, Rights and Values Programme will receive some additional, I think, 800 million for a total of 552 billion, if I'm not mistaken. Just to say a few words about the rule of law report, because I see that we are running a little bit out of time. The publication of the first rule of law report is at the center of the new European rule of law mechanism. And this is an important moment for the whole Union. It marks the first time that the Union starts a systematic reflection on the situation of the rule of law in all its member states. It is a first important step to further strengthen also the interinstitutional cooperation on this matter. This is a sign of maturity for our Union, I would say. And the report allows us to enter a new stage in the protection and the promotion of the rule of law in the Union. The mechanism, the European rule of law mechanism, it's not only the report, it has a rule of law toolbox, and the idea is to serve to deepen the dialogue and join the awareness of the rule of law throughout the Union. It is a sort of a yearly process and plays the role of a preventive mechanism. During this process, we aim to prevent the problems from emerging or deepening. The report covers both positive and challenging developments in the Union and includes a sort of a country-specific assessment of all the 27 member states. This year, the first report looked at 4 key areas: the independence, quality, and efficiency of justice systems, the anti-corruption framework, media pluralism and media freedom, and the fourth and final, the last but not least, area is the other institutional issues linked to checks and balances. As previous speakers mentioned, checks and balances are at the core of the rule of law. They guarantee the functioning, cooperation, and mutual control of state organs so that power is exercised by one state authority with the scrutiny of others. So in addition to the effective justice systems, check and balances rely on a transparent, accountable, and democratic pluralistic process for enacting laws, the separation of powers that we all know, but of course, the participation and the involvement of the civil society. For instance, in the report, it has been monitored the use of fast track and emergency procedures, the regime of the constitutional review of laws, and all the constitutional reforms to strengthen the check and balances. There is a positive side, there is a positive note. There is a healthy debate in some member states on strengthening the legal and constitutional safeguards. But of course, in other member states, it has been showed that the civic space has a sort of shrinking space. The pandemic, the health crisis, also provided very good examples of the functioning of the checks and balances, and the Commission has followed very closely the impact of the pandemic and all the emergency measures that have been taken by the member states. And the report refers to these as long as they are related to the rule of law. An enabling framework for the civil society allows for debate and scrutiny of those in power. And as is the case for independent journalists, for instance, and critical media, attempts to suppress civil society actors and should always be considered always as a warning sign with regard to the rule of law. I will not, because I see that we are a bit late, I'm not going to give you examples of different member states, but I do encourage you to look at this first rule of law report, which is an annual exercise. It will be published each and every year. And what we need to do now is to advance the debate at national level. It is up to the European institutions, the politicians, the civil society organizations, the academics, the experts, everybody needs to take part in this discussion. The idea is to make this mechanism a reality. So to be a real pillar for the protection of our democracies. Of course, the rule of law report is one of the tool of the rule of law toolbox that we have at our disposal and has been developed throughout the years. There is also the infringement proceedings, and the Commission also showed that they will never hesitate to take any action against measures regarding civil society that are contrary to the EU law. There are examples. There were infringement launched, for instance, against Hungary. And the European Court of Justice also had the opportunity to make clear that civil society organizations, I quote, must be able to pursue their activities and operate without unjustified interference by the state. It recognized also that the right to freedom of association constitutes one of the essential foundations of a democratic and pluralistic society, as it enables citizens to act collectively in areas of common interest, and in so doing contribute to the proper functioning of public life. So now we have to try to promote this rule of law culture, and this debate and this round table, I think, comes at a very timely moment to show the importance to foster the dialogue, and the Commission has been committed to ensure and enable and support the environment for civil societies organization and the right defenders. And I want really to thank from this round table all the valuable input that we received throughout the preparatory process of the first rule of law report. We had the chance to meet in the virtual country visits that we organized in May and June. We had 300 virtual visits in the capitals, where we had the opportunity also, of course, to meet national authorities, but also representatives from the civil society. And I also want to stress the willingness to contribute to the very open and targeted consultation we had, where about 200 stakeholders sent us contribution, and the civil society was very valuably contributed to this. This process will be repeated also this year. We will start at a very early stage now, because we have a sort of know-how in a way. I would like to thank for the contribution so far, and encourage you to take part to this discussion at all levels. You can do that. I think I stop here because I see it's already 7:30, and thank you very much for inviting me and for your attention.
Thank you for being with us. Thank you also for your patience. And now we are going to our last speaker, Anna Donat. She is also a member of the European Parliament, and she also has a background in civil society. She comes from Hungary, so I think this is enough to introduce her. We were talking so far about preventive measures with the first rule of law report. The European Parliament recently adopted a resolution calling for an interinstitutional agreement to safeguard union values, also proposing a number of corrective mechanisms or measures. Maybe you can introduce a little bit of background about this, and how do you think that we can take more proactive action, so to say, against these breaches, because unfortunately since 2010, when Orban started the constitutional reform, we are still tolerating him and mostly his deeds in the European Union since 2015, since the PiS government took office. Not so much progress has been done, unfortunately, to stop them from dismantling rule of law. And as we saw, this has a contagious effect across Europe, and we really need the EU to be strong and to act against and to safeguard the values and the fundamental rights. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. I try to be really brief as we are running out of time, and I think it's better if we let the participants, the attendees, to ask questions in this regard. I'm in a very difficult position because every time I'm invited, I'm supposed to explain so many things about Hungary that you can't go through really deeply, fastly. But I think we have to go back to the beginning of the theories, or how everything's rooted in order to understand what's the problem. I think everybody knows, but it's good to repeat that the right of freedom of assembly and association is enshrined in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. However, the way member state implements it is under their jurisdiction. And the problem starts here. Although in a perfect world, there would be no problem with that. While the right of peaceful assembly is not absolute and may be limited by law for certain imperative legitimate reasons, including public safety or public health, any limitations also have to undergo a check of their necessity and proportionality. The problem is how to measure that, and who's gonna say what is included in that. And this is where we get to the point, some governments with authoritarian and illiberal tendencies may be tempted to extend restrictions beyond the public emergency to silence civil society activists, squash dissent, or use the pandemic as a camouflage to pass bills and laws that has nothing to do with, for instance, the coronavirus. This is exactly what's happening in Hungary. The problem is that from a European perspective, or a European institutions perspective, it's obvious that rule of law, democracy, and fundamental rights go hand in hand. There's no question. It's in the treaty. And everybody who joined this club agreed on that. But it was not prepared, and there's still no good tools in our hands. What to do if in a member state, it's instead of rule of law, it's ruled by law, and using democracy as a circus and only exist in paper, and human rights are actually just a part, so some sentences in the constitutions. And the problem is that if there's a pandemic hitting the whole situation, what's the first everybody putting aside? Human rights, just like freedom of assembly or freedom of association. Hungary, as Daniel Freund mentioned many times, we can give you the best examples how their mastermind to misuse power and shrinking freedom and freedom rights. Already, the Hungarian legislation regarding assemblies, which was adopted late in 2018, had already a lot of obstacles created within. So already before, it was not easy. However, nowadays, just to give you one example, what's happening, Hungary was one of the first country in the beginning of the second wave, shutting down its borders. There were one exceptions. If somebody wanted to come to attend football matches. Football matches could be attended longer than organized cultural or public events or public gatherings. So the right of assembly was already shrunken before. The best hobby of our prime minister, for instance. And everything depends on the goodwill of the police. Meanwhile, the first wave, there were a series of honking demonstrations. That was a way to how to safeguard safety, but also showing public opinion on what's happening, because they misuse the power of the emergency law. All the participants were fined unfairly. Meanwhile, when a right-wing demonstration happened because there were some fights when assumably people with Roma background killed a kid, and a far-right demonstration was happening because of that, and it was called as a funeral because that was an exception in the law, the police allowed to do that. So, and I think this shows it all. Nowadays, of course, since 11th of this November, demonstrations are banned again. But ironically, it happened just one day before that, and they before the complete of ban entered into force, that the government proposed a modification on electoral law and the package of amending the constitution itself again, because after midnight it was not allowed to go to demonstrate. And how to connect it back to the beginning. I'm really welcoming, and I think many of us welcoming the rule of law report, yearly report, annual report of the Commission. I also really support the aim behind it, to foster dialogue and to start a debate on a national level. However, it doesn't give an answer yet to how what to do with those breaches, because we expect that the other side want to willingly participate. But I think Hungary showed in the past 10 years that our government has a supermajority within the country, therefore they don't need to debate with anybody. They don't need to start a dialogue. And they can, because of their power, they can show why nobody's business is what they are doing. So I really hope that that the rule of law report, the rule of law mechanism, and all of this are really good tools. But I really hope that EU will be able to, the Commission will be able to collect all these tools and use it at once. Infringement procedure, 7th article procedure, the rule of law mechanism, and so on and forth. Because separately, we already see what happened in the past 10 years. It doesn't result what from a European side we all expect from all the member states. So, and what civil society can do, empower Hungarian or Polish or other civil societies who are in the situation that the space around them is shrinking. Empower and support each other, because I think we're not talking about this enough. It also gives a big power. I'm coming from the civil society. I know how does it feel to feel left alone, because who cares what's happening in Europe? And I'm happy to see that lately is changing. Europe is opening its eyes, because what's happening in Hungary is not a Hungarian issue. What's happening in Poland is not a Polish issue. Those are European issues. So I think we can only find a solution together, but we also need to be politically braver. I'm talking about a European level, because those illiberal, autocratic powers and regimes only understand the language of power. If we want to start a dialogue, nothing gonna change. We have to be stronger, and we have to fight for European values and not just talk about it. It's really nice, it's written in the treaties in the 2nd article, when we finally have to use not just preventive tools, but just like the new rule of law mechanism, we need more active tools in order to regulate if somebody doesn't want to follow the common rules. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna, for this very energizing closing of the first session. We are quite behind the schedule, but I'm also very much concerned not to totally frustrate the participants that still stayed with us until now. So Jada informed me that she collected some questions from the audience. Can you please, Jada, connect with us and share a few with the panelists, so that we organize a short roundup with last answers from the panelists? Jada, yes.
Yes. I read that Linda Ravo from Civil Liberties Europe shared 3 questions. Whether the Commission intends to accompany the rule of law monitoring with the recommendations to member states, and if there could be synergies between this process and other international processes like the UPR, whether the European Parliament organizes a regular interparliamentary dialogue with the national parliaments on the state of civic space in each country. And finally, whether the EU funding will be available under the future Justice, Rights and Values Fund to support the rights defenders to litigate violations on civic freedoms, including breaches of protesters' rights. We also had a couple of interventions reminding a new legislation that is on the table now in Denmark. I encourage everybody to read the comment, and I will send it also to the EU representatives, as well as the Hungarian situation that also Anna Donat just reminded.
Okay, so these were the questions. Before passing the floor to the panelists, because most of the questions were addressed to institutionals, maybe our civic activist speakers would have some questions themselves to address, and you have the chance to be able to take the floor directly. So if this is the case, please give me a sign. No. I don't see any sign, so then we will go ahead, and maybe let's start the other way around. Let's start with Anna first now, if you want to answer the questions first, and then we will give the floor to Nyoviringu.
Well, I'm really sorry because I heard only partly the question. So if you can...
yes, there was one question regarding recommendations to member states in the rule of law report. So probably this question is more targeting the European Commission. There was another question whether there is a regular interparliamentary dialogue between the EU and national parliaments, and whether there is EU funding in the upcoming Rights and Values Program for civic activists to uphold these rights and values on the ground.
Yes, I would start the last, as I'm the shadow rapporteur of the Rights and Values Program file from Renew Europe Group, so I follow it closely. But I think also the Commission side, I can tell it that one of the happy news lately is that Rights and Values got 800 million more in the next MFF, and I think it's a good sign. Because EU decision makers could finally show that we are not just want to do something with the breaches of rule of law. We are not just punishing through mechanisms and new tools. We're not just regulating, but we actively support and protect those values and helping those who can do it the closest possible for the people. So civil society, I think, I don't think that's there enough money in this cause, but I think it's a good news that although half a year ago we were all worried that the first budget line which was cut was rights and values, for instance, at the end, it got a bigger amount of budget. Right now it's still a negotiation how to proportionate the extra amount, but I think it's a good news. About interparliamentary debates, I'm happy to say that finally it started to happen. I already attended in the LIBE committee multiple hearings, which was already interparliamentary. So national parliament delegates were attending and could be a part of the debate. I think it's a really good step to start dialogues also about detailed issues and not just big issues. However, I would want to say that first of all, in an online way, it's not really a debate culture. Everybody's telling their opinion after each other, and then it's the end of the conversation. So there's a lot to improve. Secondly, for instance, just 2 days ago at the LIBE committee meeting, the topic was the 7th article procedures in Hungary and Poland. And guess who were the ones who were not showed up? Representation of the governments, but they were invited. So it is, I think, a really important possibility to organize common hearings with international delegates. However, it also depends whether they're coming or not. And again, on those situations when it would be really necessary to have those debates face to face, they are not coming. So we're working on that, but it's already happening, and I think it's a good sign.
Thank you, Anna. Before giving the floor to Nyoviringu, I would like myself to add a question to the ones that have been already posed, and namely whether, I mean, this would be one of our main recommendations or demand that is stemming from these 2 days of debate, whether you think there is scope to introduce the freedom of assembly in the next year's rule of law report as part of the checks and balances. Of course, we appreciate very much already that civic space has been introduced as such. We would also hope to introduce a broader exception of the civic space, not only from the legal perspective, and as such, not only assessing the response of the governments, but also really engaging with civil society, also regarding not only legislation, but how legislation is implemented and all other measures that go beyond legislation and shrink and close our democratic space. So yes, just let me know if you need me to repeat also the other questions that have been asked by the audience.
So it's me now, Niovi,
yes.
From
yes.
Commission. Yes. No, I noted down. The first question is from Linda, who is asking if the report would be accompanied by recommendations. Then, for the time being, it's not envisaged to have formal recommendations. These recommendations are adopted in the context of the European semester process, where the Commission proposes to the Council country-specific recommendations, and the Council itself adopts the country-specific recommendation. This is something that is foreseen in the treaties. So, in fact, the report the idea is to have a monitoring and mapping, and with the dialogue also that has started at the level of the Council, where there is the rule of law dialogue, where the member states can ask questions to the other member states. This has started already the 17th of November in the General Affairs Council. So, on the basis of the chapter, so this is a sort of indirect recommendations, I would say, that the dialogue and the questions that are asked by the member states to their peers also play a role of recommending that maybe something is not going well or something should change. But the report as such, the objective is not to address recommendations, but to give an objective and a very consistent overview of what is happening on the ground for these 4 key areas. And coming to the second question about the scope, for the time being, we will reflect on the scope. The part on the check and balances, of course, is a sort of a broad area, but there is nothing yet decided as to change the scope, at least for the second rule of law report. But we are in a reflection process, I would say.
Thank you for the answers. And now I give the floor to Birgit if she wants to bring some clarifications or to make some comments.
Yes, so I'm sorry, I can't turn on my video anymore. It's not working. But I wanted to first of all pay tribute to the various human rights defenders who are on this call and who really testify about the challenges that they face in their country, and let them know that they are not alone. You know, that we are following closely. The High Commissioner for Human Rights is also following closely. And for those of you who are also already looking at national recourse mechanisms, I just would like to reiterate that there are also international mechanisms that you can seize. We have here, for example, the Secretariat of the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Assembly on this call. And, you know, when I hear you talking about Spain, for example, and my question would be, have you considered filing a complaint to a treaty body? Have you considered submitting a communication to special procedures? And just to let you know that that exists. And in line here with also, we of course support also the question of broadening the scope to include freedom of assembly in the European Union's rule of law report. And I actually had the privilege of having that conversation with Commissioner Reinders himself. He said that that was unlikely because that is being dealt with, as we heard also before, in the framework of other strategies and discussions. And I think we're seeing a lot of flurry of activity here, which is really positive, like MEP Donat also says, that, you know, finally the topic is really being heard. But there needs to be also coherence between the various strategies and mechanisms that are put in place. And we have to avoid that human rights, democracy, and the rule of law are sort of siloed from each other, because that would not be helpful. And in that sense, please allow me also to bring in the question from Linda Ravo on the UPR. We think that, as you say, the Commission's report does not go into recommendations, and we understand it's an assessment. But there have been assessments for decades that have been made by special procedures and by the treaty bodies on elements of the rule of law, and that were only very scarcely, if at all, referenced in the previous Commission's the first annual report. Now, of course, we understand this had to be done very quickly, and it was the first report, but we definitely look forward to also help to contribute some of the findings over many years of EU countries with respect to the rule of law, so that this can be reflected. Because to strengthen the rules-based international order, it's important that there is a coherence between what's happening at the regional level and what's happening at the international level, and that we're not creating sort of parallel systems. Also, drawing on the UPR, when you look at the UPR's methodology, the whole peer review is actually very transparent and open. And we hope also that the peer review by the Council can eventually evolve into a process where also civil society, national human rights institutions, and regional organizations could participate and contribute to the various recommendations. So that is what I wanted to highlight today. And thank you again, and wish you all really a lot of courage, and to thank you for the work that you are doing, which you are doing really on behalf of all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Birgit. It's really appreciated, I think, your intervention. I'm really sorry for the technical situation. It's really strange to look at the screen where you see names and you see 2 pictures and you see that you have 60 participants. Let's hope that one day we will get back to not to normal, what is normal, but to a situation where we can exchange and see our faces. In the meantime, I think that a lot will still rely on our shoulders and on the shoulders of activists and people that take to the streets. We heard today some encouragements. I think we need to see also urgently, I think we need to all get a sense of urgency, of the need to act, because with the outbreak of the pandemic and the very serious economic and social crisis that it will trigger once the health emergency will be behind us, hopefully with a vaccine and everything, I think that Europe's streets will be even more crowded than today with dissent. And if the only response to this dissent, to holding our societies together, is to repress and to violent people, then we should be very, very worried about the future that we have. So I would really like to end by reiterating a call to the European institutions to be braver, to be stronger. We know that we have good allies in you. Today, the panelists that accepted to be here with us, but you will have to be very strong and to convince and to be very loud in your ranks, because we really need Europe to become stronger. We saw how strong is Europe to sanction non-compliance with economic rules, but we see how weak are our mechanisms when it comes to defending our foundations in the end. So we should really be all quite concerned about what the absence of a strong response to this situation will trigger in the future. In any case, I think that we saw that civil society is crucial. There is a lot of motivation, a lot of energy, but let's not let all this go to waste. Thank you all for being here, and I think the fight will go on. And next week we have another important policy debate to present our general assessment of the state of civic space in a broader context with institutional and outstanding civic activists. Thank you once again. My apologies again for technical problems, and also for all the brave participants that bared with us without being given the possibility to intervene. Let's hope for a better situation in the future. Thank you. May the strength and the force be with you. And with us all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.